Hello and welcome. I'm Jane, and today we are so privileged to be joined by Dr. Simon Longstaff AO. Simon, welcome.
Hi, Jane. Nice to be with you.
It's a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for taking the time. So, Simon, we first met during the first week of the MBA program. You were delivering the loaded topic of ethics. We were sitting in an auditorium full of 50 smart, energetic type A personalities, and you were delivering a loaded topic such as ethics. Yet you had this unique ability to make us all feel like we were just having a yarn over a cuppa in your living room. Talking about ethics, it is a loaded topic, but it was something that became quite easy, digestible, and most of all, practicable for all of us. Where did you learn such skill?
Oh, from the early masters. I mean, it shouldn't be that difficult. Unfortunately, the word's got a bit of a bad rap over the centuries because, as you would have picked up during the course of our conversation, it really is just an attempt by human beings to try and make sense of how choices come to be made and how the world emerges from those choices. So it's right there at the foundation of everything that humans do. It's just that we don't know about that. So when people hear the word, they think, oh, it's about judgment and people are going to be told they're good or bad. It's not really about that. It's rather about the notion of a kind of reflective practice that helps you get a grip on the world. And I picked that up from reading about the people who were the earliest practitioners of this, people like the Greek philosopher Socrates and those who came after him. And for most of the period that I'm interested in, they didn't do this in a university setting so much as out there in the marketplace. It was about ordinary people going about their day-to-day lives. And so I've always thought that would be a rather good way to bring it back to its foundation so that, as you described it, it can be something much more engaging than people think at the beginning.
I'd like to talk about your earlier life. So your mum passed away when you were 7. You traveled around Australia. You built kinship ties with the Anindili people, became the trustee of the Future Fund. You moved away from Groot, moved to Tasmania, studied, became a teacher, moved to Cambridge, studied, became a teacher. Do you think that the Ethics Centre would still be around if you had different life experiences?
I'd probably be there because I think any institution is larger than the individuals within it, but it would be very different. And I should say all those things you mentioned, I didn't do them all at once. There's a bit of a sequence in that over a number of years. But for me, the time spent on Groot Island and in outback Queensland and places like that was just as important as my master's degree and my doctorate from Cambridge, from Magdalen College. And that is because it meant that I learnt very early on in my life that people, fitters and truck drivers and people working in mobile maintenance workshops, people like that in mining, were just as capable of engaging in really fantastic conversations about deeply important questions as professors in a place like Cambridge. Now, they had different language. It wasn't as if you had to think, oh, well, you've got to go to university to find smart people engaged with deep questions of life. And the second thing, of course, it meant that you started to see how the day-to-day choices that a person makes really matter on the ground. I mean, I was at the bottom of the heap in a corporation like BHP when I first arrived just after my 17th birthday on Groot Island. I was a cleaner and I spent my time emptying rubbish bins and confronting the extraordinary olfactory assault of approaching in the middle of the wet season, this stale milkshake and prawn combination. I mean, it's just, even when I think about it, my nose wrinkles. But I started to see, in industrial relations, in the sorts of issues I was dealing with, which increasingly became ones that touched on life and death, literally on life and death, how important questions of the kind that ethics seeks to answer actually are, because it wasn't about quarantining them and say, oh, well, it's obviously about, issues of war or stem cell research or voluntary assisted dying. It was about day-to-day stuff. And so once I learned all that, that's what I brought into my philosophy. And as I said at the beginning, it wasn't as if I was doing something really new. this had been the practice in the past, but it was lost or mediated along the way.
Mm. How was your time spent with the Anindili Alcorn people shape the way you view ethics?
Well, it's taken me a long time to really get to the kind of the nub of it. I'd always thought that it was just the extraordinary privilege of being included into a rich and complex society, which I'd not been born into, but was invited to become part of.
Mm.
But I actually realised in the course of doing a radio interview with Richard Feidler on the ABC that they'd actually taught me something which I'd never really connected to one of the major areas of how I practice philosophy. So my work, it's very much engaged in day-to-day life, as I've mentioned, but it's also incredibly diverse. It ranges from things to do with military, sport, banking and finance, big corporations, government, pretty much right across the spectrum of human affairs here in Australia and increasingly abroad. And the thing that I've always noticed about it is that I was very good at finding all the patterns. So there are patterns that you see, say, in the preparation of soldiers to go to places like Iraq and Afghanistan and how they manage risk and performance, which are incredibly important if grasped by those in, say, a corporate setting, if you can just get them to see it. You know, I was talking about pattern making, and I realised that that was in fact one of the major lessons I'd been taught by the mob up on Groote Island. They'd taken me to the end of a wharf in Aliangula, where the ship loader is, and they wanted to teach me how to see dolphins. And I'd always thought, oh, you just look for dolphins. There are dolphins in the water. You either see them or you don't. But the whole way of seeing was challenged when they said, no, your problem is you're looking for the dolphins in the water. That's not how you see dolphins. What you see are patterns. There's a pattern the dolphins make in the water, and there's a pattern without them, and so forth. Anyway, that had happened, and I'd sort of known that conversation had taken place, and I'd known that I'd learnt to start to do this, not with the same proficiency that people do it for their whole life, but I sort of got it. And that was the thing which in subconscious must have gone right into the back of my brain, because that's what I was drawing on all the time. So I've carried their lesson through my whole life, along with that sense of bonding, connection to place, to history, and of course also a recognition that in my case that I am still, despite an association that goes back many, many decades now, I'm still in my infancy in terms of understanding the complexity of their world, which is multi-layered and structured, and it's reflected in language and custom and all the rest. And yes, they're good enough to tolerate me, or in fact to welcome me in, but I don't have the mastery. I'm like a toddler compared to the average sophistication of a teenager or someone like that.
Yeah. I think what really resonated with me during our session at Ethics was your acknowledgement. It was the first time I've ever seen it just done through the heart, simple, authentic, and genuine. So thank you for that.
The acknowledgement of country.
Yes, acknowledgement of country, correct.
Yeah, it's, you know, I think it's one of those gifts that the Australian people haven't quite recognised yet. That there's so much packed into that acknowledgement that if you just you don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about the language, like just one curiosity. You say, okay, I'm now going to do an acknowledgement of country. And the first thing that you say, if you follow the normal conventions, is to say, I'd like to acknowledge in the case where we were, the Bedegal people at that time, or whoever it is. And no one ever stops and says, isn't that strange? We're doing a thing called acknowledgement of country, but we're getting by talking about people. That's not an accident. It's not a slip of the tongue. It all comes from the fact that in that world, the people are of the country. The country is of them. It's not as if they live in it or on it. They are of it. Yeah. And if you just step back from it, as I hope people do, then it stops becoming just a dry ritual where people say, oh, tick the box, we're going to do an acknowledgement of country, but it really draws you into something quite profound. And of course, it's then, the reason I call it a gift is because we can all then start to get that understanding that lies behind it and incorporate it in the way that is generously offered to everybody in Australia, whether they're of First Nations heritage or not. Everybody's invited, particularly since the Uluru Statement in the Heart, to become at one with that kind of understanding and connection. So yeah, thank you for noticing that. But I think it's one of those remarkable things that we've got in Australia that we perhaps don't fully understand or appreciate.
Yeah, we are so fortunate that we have the anti-European in one of our cohorts, and she was very generous with sharing her understanding and culture and awareness of what acknowledgement of country really means. But I agree. I think we're only just scratching the surface here, but there's a lot more that we can do in terms of appreciating the culture and also incorporating that culture to our own everyday lives, because we are part of that culture now as well.
Yeah.
In terms of just closing that gap with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community in Australia, what do you think as leaders and future leaders, what can we do to genuinely close the gap and build towards a better reconciliated world in Australia?
I think the first thing is to listen, and to listen without judgment about the stories of this place, the truth. I mean, the place we call Australia, with that deep history going back tens of thousands of years, is sort of, it's riven through all of its various structures, these stories. Now, some of the stories, no matter how far back you go, are stories that inspire and of good things, but they're also of things which are dark and challenging, and that's always been the way. And I think that's like the truth. I mean, the truth, even since European colonisation, is there are some good things, but there's lots of bad things too. And if you can just listen to it and take what's being offered, then I think you begin to get a deep understanding. And then it's not so hard actually for people who have come from other parts to look back at their own deeper history and see what happened. I mean, people, for example, of British stock, they don't really think about it, but they were subject to invasion and colonisation by the Romans, the Vikings, by the Normans. I mean, the sad thing is that having gone through their own experiences of dispossession and all the rest, you think, oh, well, maybe you don't have to do it to somebody else. But at least there's a point of contact, and you can see how things can work through, and over enough time, there can be a reclaiming of place and purpose and all the rest. So that's the first thing. And I think the second thing is to allow First Nations people to be as diverse as everybody else, not to expect everybody to be brilliant all the time, not to impose upon people a standard of perfection that they have to sort of live up to all the time, because we don't do it to anyone else. We've got people in every community that you'll find in the world. There are some really impressive people, there are some people who are pretty ordinary, there are some generous, open-hearted people, there are selfish people. And we tend not to allow that diversity to exist, so that, because we put people into the kind of pigeonhole, oh, well, you're First Nations, you're this or that. And I think those are the two things. And then the third thing, maybe there are three, I think, is to accept the generosity of the offer and to recognise that movements that, say, are around things like a voice or Makarrata, they're not just about something which people believe to be good for First Nations people. They're just about, as much about what's good for everybody, and it's offered in that spirit. So those are just three things I'd look to do. There'll be a million other bits going on all the time, but they're kind of core tenets that I think we can adhere to.
Yep, that's great. Thank you so much for that. On a side note, you apparently you've been working on children's stories.
I have. I've published one. Yeah.
Oh, nice. What was it? What was it about?
Well, it's called The Spider's Song, and I wrote it just before, around the time my first of two children was born, and it was really an attempt for me to reflect on a few things. Firstly, I loved the old-fashioned children's story picture books, that used to exist in the past, where there's a fairly chunky story but lots of illustrations that really engage. And so the classic ones of history are things like Alice in Wonderland. And Pooh Bear and all those sorts of things. And in this case, what I wanted to do was a reflection on the risks associated with the arrogance of humans and of science, and a very deep tendency that you see within human history to try and control things, particularly in nature. But it doesn't just have to be nature, it can also be attempts to control other human beings.
Mm.
And so I wanted to create a kind of fable about that tendency
Yeah.
and then subvert it with the way in which nature, in the form of the spider,
Mm.
can actually prevail, but it also can offer us something that genuinely enlightens our lives. So it's sort of, it's just like a fable. It's a fairy story, really, a modern day one, with
Yeah.
outlandish characters and strange creatures, and it's peppered with beautiful illustrations by Mark van der Grient, who's a Dutch artist, and poetry, and so it's got a bit of prose and a bit of poetry, little rhymes and things, and these beautiful pictures. And it was published a few years ago, and it's at least, I know, been translated into Polish, because I received out of the blue, a copy of this book in Polish. I thought, wow, it's amazing. So it's not ever going to make me wealthy or famous, but it was a lovely thing to have done, and it's an outlet for that part of my personality, which isn't just about rational argument, but also has a creative side.
Well, congratulations for that. Hopefully there'll be a sequel.
I've got one in mind. I just haven't had a chance to write it yet, and of course I have to convince Mark and then a publisher to take on a second edition.
Okay, that's great. Let me know how that goes. Talking about books, I also got another one of yours.
Ah, yes. Well, that's
So I was working in the financial services industry during the GFC, during the Royal Commission, and now the aftermath. And I really like what you've put in this book. On the conclusion, you said, to choose the life of the professions is to commit to lifelong learning and practice in the service of others. And that's such an elegant way of putting it. You know, a lot of my colleagues have either left the industry or are just consistently complaining about what we all have to deal with in the financial services industry. But you're right, it's all about servicing others, and it is a lifelong pursuit of excellence, I guess.
It is, but it's also a really profound choice. And I mean, it's something that a lot of people in financial advice did say they wanted to do, which was to make that transition from being a market-based guild, if you like, or grouping, into a genuine profession. And the differences, which are outlined in the book, are pretty significant. So the world of the market, which is the dominant mode in which people engage in commerce, it actually licenses the pursuit of self-interest ever since the time of the Scottish moral philosopher Adam Smith, where he wrote in The Wealth of Nations, it's not through benevolence that the butcher or the brewer or the baker make provision for our dinner. It's instead out of their self-interest. And we lead that invisible hand. We hope that that will increase the stock of common good, which is the ultimate test of whether a market's working well or not. Not whether a few people are better off, but whether everybody's better off. But then in the market, not only are you allowed to pursue self-interest, but you do that through satisfying the wants of other people. So the classic case is someone coming into a corner store and saying, look, I want a block of chocolate. The merchant doesn't care why they want it. They only want to know is, can you pay for it? And then if you can, there it is. The professions, on the other hand, completely reject that and say, no, I'm going to subordinate my self-interest. That is, I'm going to elevate the interests of others, and I'm not going to give them what they want, but I'll serve their interests. So that same person who came into the corner store, if they go to their doctor's surgery and they're a diabetic, there's no way ever the doctor's going to give them a block of chocolate if they know that that's going to harm the interests of their patient. So people going back in financial advice and financial services more generally said, oh, we're part of the market. You know, what we've got to do is we just got to do what's good for us and we just give people what they want. And then some groups said, well, actually, no, we'd much rather have the benefits, which means also including taking on the costs of being a profession. They did it. I think some of them had really clear eyes. I mean, there were groups like surgeons who used to be part of the market. They were guilds and they didn't have the status, anything like the status that we accord to surgeons today, nor did they have the wealth that they can generate if they're excellent in their profession. And they only decided in 1800, so only a couple of hundred years ago, to move from being members of guilds in the market where they were barber surgeons together into this distinct profession. And then the last of the barber surgeons, when did they die? 1840. So it's, you know, in historical terms, it's relatively recent. And I haven't missed out. You know, it's not as if they're all wandering around. You don't see too many surgeons who are really struggling. And so that was the gift that was on offer to people in financial advice. They could, if they'd wanted to, wholeheartedly embrace that opportunity. And it would have meant some sacrifice, but they didn't. They said they wanted it, and some truly did. A whole lot then complained they wanted to still be able to offer conflicted advice. They didn't want to be part of a profession if it meant having to take on additional obligations. And the sad thing for me in seeing that all unfold was the way in which younger people coming into financial advice were robbed of that possibility and almost have to go back to square one now to claim it for themselves if they want it. Because so often those who spoke in their name actually pursued a political agenda which have denied them the fruits of that earlier decision.
Yeah, yeah. Hopefully things will turn around with the current government, make things a little bit easier for the young ones to start in the industry.
I don't know. I think it's going to be younger people really coming to grips with that choice and saying, okay, we really want to do this. We really want to end up with the same status and position of people like doctors and lawyers, and we're willing to make the transition happen. And unless they drive it from the bottom up, I fear that the older people who, anyway, I'm not unmindful of their circumstances. If you spent 50 years doing something and it's all of a sudden said to you, well, you can't do that anymore because you don't meet the educational or professional standards, that's tough, and maybe there should have been better transition arrangements. But that group are trying to rob the younger people of that better future.
Yep. Okay. Festival of Dangerous Ideas coming up next month. Oh no, September 17 to 18. What can we expect?
Well, I wish we were doing this in a couple of weeks' time because I could take you through the program then and tell you precisely who's speaking, but I can't do that because I would be shot by the festival director, Daniel Harvey. But the Festival of Dangerous, I'll tell you some general stuff about it. It was created more than 10 years ago by the then CEO of the Opera House, Richard Evans, and myself. We'd always wanted to do things together. We finally could, and we recognised that there was a real need for something more than just a writers' festival, which brings together people with really interesting ideas or topical publications. We wanted something that pushed at the edges of what was acceptable in public debate. And we did it for a serious reason. And that was to try and, by pushing at the edges, to maintain as far as possible a middle space, an open space, which was less contentious, where people could still come together and feel safe to discuss issues in a way that's often shut down by people who say from a conservative agenda or a progressive agenda or whatever, oh no, you can't say this, you can't say that. We're going to cancel this, we're going to deplatform that. We said, no, we're going to really work hard at that. And over those years, it's been really successful at bringing in emerging and top international thinkers who've, what they've said, they've never thought it sounded particularly dangerous because to them it seems obvious, but to people who've heard them, whether it's someone arguing for polygamy or somebody arguing that waterboarding's okay, through to people saying that watch out for Putin, he's a megalomaniac. Anyway, that's the sort of territory you get where nearly everyone who speaks, nearly every kind of topic, someone somewhere is going to say, ouch, don't like that. So all we ask people to do is to enjoy the excitement of coming and listening. You don't have to agree, just listen and see what it means to you. So this year, it's going to be a really strong field of international speakers in economics, topics. One of the topics is just absolute taboo. No one's allowed to talk about it. It'll be on there. It won't just be talks. The original vision that Richard and I had was for arts as well. So there'll be some extraordinary artworks, one which is a brand new piece that's been specifically commissioned for FODI. There's another one which is going to be absolutely thrilling for people. It's kind of got a participation component in it. And there'll be so you get some of the world's most significant thinkers, including current, up and coming, really pushing some challenging ideas, or what I think are challenging ideas, across the spectrum from things which are about business and economics all the way to the kind of geopolitical issues and the way we live our lives on a day-to-day basis.
Yep, great. Can't wait for it. Thanks for
And
making it happen.
When it's released, you'll be able to post a link and people will be able to see the program.
Yes, I'll link. I post a link to the website anyway, and then you should automatically update when it's ready.
Yeah.
Yep, perfect. Talking about dangerous ideas and geopolitical tension. And I take an example of the former governor of Jakarta in Indonesia. He was one of the most ethical, straightforward, highly efficient leader. And yet he was too ethical for his own good in an environment where corruption is rife, and becoming too ethical can be a stepping stone on someone else's way. Do you think there could be times or locations where you can be too ethical for your own good?
I don't think you can be too, well, it's a really important question. I think you can not be too ethical for your own good. I think you can be too impractical for your own good. So ethics is, as much as anything else, about a kind of practical wisdom, not just a kind of a theory or where you do nothing, or something where you do something in a reckless way that doesn't actually even generate positive outcomes. Now, there's a fine balance between these. And of course, any kind of ethical life which challenges a norm, and it doesn't have to be major corruption, it could just be something going on in a workplace where everybody just does it because it's always been done. Every form of it requires some measure of moral courage. And not just moral courage, but it requires the skills to be able to do that without destroying yourself or others around you, and to bring about an effective result. So I think there are questions about timing. There are questions about how you form alliances around the ethical positions you hold. I think there are opportunities for you to have people who are powerful come to see why it is in their interests that they support the thing you're doing. There are ways of presenting it which let people suddenly say, aha, I get it now, without it seeming as if it's being, pushed upon them. But one cannot discount completely the capacity of people from self-interest to protect themselves if they think that any kind of reform will lead to them losing some advantage, whether it be in the form of income, power, prestige, or whatever. And there are some people who are so disregarding of others' interests in terms of preserving for themselves or sometimes their family or a dynasty, that they will literally try to destroy someone who gets in the way of it. This has got nothing to do with popular opinion. So you take something like corruption, even in those countries which are judged to be the most corrupt on the planet, you will not find many people, certainly not many ordinary people, who say, hey, guess what? We've got this fantastic thing called corruption. It's just runs in our culture. If you want your children to sit at the front of the class, guess what you get to do? You get to put money in an envelope, give it to the teacher, and they're at the front of the class. So no one thinks it's a good idea, but even where it's most endemic, it's just that they don't really hope that it can be different. So trying to look at structural changes and have this smart engagement becomes something, knowing that what you are seeking to oppose, if it is something like corruption, is widely reviled by ordinary people who suffer through it rather than celebrate it.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Simon. If there was one thing that our listeners can take away from this chat, what would that be?
Think about what you do and why you do, and try and tie it back to a clear and specific framework of core values and principles. In other words, don't let yourself just float along according to unthinking custom and practice. If somebody tells you that something is being done because everybody does it, or it's just the way it's done around here, you ought to shake in your boots with terror, because that's the kind of organisation which is heading for a nasty fall.
Dr. Simon Longstaff, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. Have a great time with your family at Tassie.
Thanks for the invitation to join you, Jane.
No problems. Thank you so much. See you then.